Welcome back to Animation Teacher. So to continue our lesson of Intro to Harmony, I'd like to take an opportunity to show you guys the main windows of our Animating workspace. So let's launch Harmony Premium. So once again, we'll create a new project. So we'll go File, New. And once again, I'll save it to my desktop just because of simplicity here. I'll just call this Windows UI. And it'll show up on the desktop. First thing to do is to save the project. And once again, once you save the project, it'll create for you a X stage with various elemental folders. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to ensure we're set to animating. Okay, and this will default to more or less what you see here. Now, if there are some layers that you don't see, for example the art layer, again just right click and activate that. So today we're going to go over a few of these tools. I'm going to pull up our tool properties so you can see exactly what we can play with in Harmony. So let's start off with the brush. Now the main differences between a brush and a pen in Harmony is the fact that for the brush you can have nice thick and thin lines automatically. However, if we go into our drawing, and I'm going to hit 2 to zoom in here, and we select this contour editor, you'll see that on a brush tool we get Bezier curves on the outside of our lines of our art. Whereas if we drew the same, more or less the same kind of line with a pen tool, you'll see that the Bezier is actually within the line, which allows us to manipulate the line like so. The nice thing about using a brush tool versus a line tool is the fact that you can actually manipulate the tapers quite easily like so. The nice thing about using a line is that not only can you move the line direction, you can change the line curve, add new curves, and you can actually adjust the Bezier too. However, it's not as quick. To do that, we're going to use the pencil editor tool here, and it'll pull up these little dots here. And to increase the size of your tip, for example, you can simply highlight it and hit up on the arrow or down. You can even manipulate each of these quadrants here. And in the tool properties, you can actually taper it off so it's a flat end, should you choose to do that as well. Okay, flat end. And because it's a line tool, using the contour editor, you can still manipulate the lines and the curves. So that's the advantage of the line and the advantage of the brush tool. Now there are other advantages when we start talking about masks and fills. Here is a fill, and basically if I select it now, if I select my fill, the fill goes up to this part of the line here. So it actually will go up until that part of the line. It's not going to fill to the edge where I'm showing you here, because the line is recognized only with the middle of the line, and that's the middle of the art. Whereas if you were to fill a shape with such as this, like a brush tool here, and you hit fill, it'll actually fill right to the edge of that shape. So I'm going to undo so you can see what how much I filled in here. Oops. So that's where I filled it. So it fills right to the edge of that. So that's primarily the difference between a brush and a pen tool. Now, as I demonstrated, the contour editor tool is so you can adjust the Bezier curves. The pencil editor tool is so you can adjust the tips of the edges of your contours for your line. The smooth editor basically just does this. If I select the smooth editor and I smooth this out, it'll basically smooth out the lines in between. So you basically just color it in so it eventually smooths out. That's rarely used. The perspective tool is kind of handy because you can actually manipulate the artwork like so. And it's all vector based, so it's nice. It's nice to be able to not have to worry about resolution. So that's the perspective tool. The envelope tool basically works more or less the same, except you get a little bit more flexibility because you're actually controlling Bezier curves as well. So all these are within the contour editor subselection group. Now the edit gradient will only work if we actually introduce a gradient. So I'm going to pull up the colors palette here, and we're going to create a new swatch. By double-clicking here, we'll select gradient, and it's similar to Photoshop. You select your first color and your second color. Do a radio, and then all you do is you can create a rectangle and fill it. Let me clear this area first. Oops. Let's select our color. And with this editor tool here, if you have it selected, you can click on the gradient and you can control the direction of your gradient. It's a circle, so it'll just taper in and out like that. You can control where it goes and how it tapers, so you just play with the controls like that. So it allows you a variety of a great amount of control. So we're going to go back to here now. Below this selection, the select arrow is the cutter. Now the cutter works like this. You basically have a piece of art and you want to cut off a piece. You can actually just highlight the piece like that and hit delete, and it'll give you a nice clean cut. So if I wanted to do an intricate cut, like so, I can select that and just cut it away. So that's the cutter tool. Reposition all drawings basically selects all the artwork on the layer and you can reposition it all. It's the equivalent to basically selecting all your artwork. Another way to do that is you can go while using this selection tool. Let's say you drew a piece of art here, and you have now two pieces of art, and you want to move both of these layers. You can simply use this tool, and under the tool properties you can apply art line and color art, which will allow you to move everything to the left. So now my sketch here, oh sorry, you have to actually show everything first, and then now you can move both layers. So that's color and line art layers. Our next tool here is our text tool. We don't have to spend too much time on this. Basically you type the text, you pick a color, and you pick the font, and you go do your thing. Okay. The next one is the eraser tool. That's pretty straightforward. Paint bucket, also straightforward. However, there are a myriad of options with the paint bucket tool. So we have regular paint, so you can paint it like so, or you can ink your lines like so. That's just for the outline. You can paint unpainted. So what that is let's say I colored everything like that, and I hit paint unpainted, and then I just select everything, and I'll just paint the unpainted areas. Here, I'll pick another color for you. Okay, so I can highlight everything, and then it'll just paint the unpainted areas. Repaint is basically the same thing, but we're just repainting the same areas that is selected. For unpaint, it's basically just undoing the paint selection and just erasing it if you select everything. Stroke is a tool that I'm not quite fond of because I like to keep my drawings clean, but this is basically how it works. So let's say you had a drawing like this and you wanted to fill that gap. There is an option where you can close a gap with the paint. If you go to paint, under the tool properties, there is a threshold that you can do where it'll fill in. I have all this art here. It'll fill in a certain point. So if I drew a circle and it wasn't quite closed, this threshold you can bring up so then it will close large gaps and it'll fill that in. But sometimes if your gap is too large, it's not going to fill it in. So what you can do is do a stroke, and a stroke is basically creating an invisible line for you then to fill your art in. The only problem is when you create a stroke, it actually creates, well, a stroke. So now you have all these excess vector points that you might not have wanted. So I'm not a huge fan of that. I mean, you can technically erase or undo the stroke afterwards, selecting it and deleting it after you filled it. That works as well. Now, I accidentally hit Control and Alt, which gives me my animation table, which is kind of cool. So if you're like me, you can only draw circles in a particular direction. This is nice and useful. However, if you're working on a Cintiq, you probably don't need this. To reset, you just hit Shift M, and that'll reset it back to its native position. Sometimes I find if you can't find your piece of art, so let's say you draw something really tiny and then you kind of move around and now you can't find anything, the best way to find your piece of artwork is just to highlight Drawing View and click on this grid. So then when you truck out, you can see your grid, and usually within the context of the grid, you'll find your art work. However, if your artwork is like just a tiny dot somewhere and you can't see it, another way to find it is to hit K. So K creates an outline on all your artwork, and then all you have to do is zoom out, and usually you can see the dots better when they're zoomed out, so you know where to erase. I'll turn that off for now, and we'll go back to our camera view. So those pretty much cover all these tool options here. Now below here we have again our rectangle tool, we have ellipse, and a polygon tool. The polygon tool works like in Illustrator. You can create shapes any way you want, and then you can fill the shapes afterwards. The other tool, I'll just set that back to line. This is the eyedropper tool. That's basically straightforward. You can color pick your color using that tool. Now this tool here we'll touch upon later on when we start creating rigs. So this is just drawing pivot tool. It's just to help you set your drawing pivots, but it's used differently than you might think. This morphing tool, it rarely works, but when it does, it's fantastic. So it's basically a shape morpher. So if you created, let's test it out here. If you created a square, and let's say on frame 10, you wanted to create a circle, and then you basically highlight these frames here, and you right click, and you can hit morph, or you can hit this button here. Actually, I think you still have to right click, create morph, and then that basically morphs your drawing over. It doesn't work all the time, but when it does, it's kind of cool. The next thing is the hand tool. The hand tool is basically for you to pan around in your camera stage or your drawing stage. Now you don't really ever have to press this button because the default shortcut is spacebar. So as long as you're holding down spacebar, you can do the same thing. Like this, the zoom tool, if you click it, you can zoom in. If you hold Alt, you can zoom out. Again, you don't need this because 1 and 2 does the same thing as your shortcuts. Again, rotate, you get this Again, you don't need this again. You can hold Control and Alt to do the same thing. So you never really need any of these. And Shift M again to reset. This animate tool basically just means that if you create an animation and you've done everything on this side, but you actually needed to frame your character into the middle without affecting any of the animation, you actually turn this off. When you turn this off, it basically deactivates any feature changes or any changes prior or after to what you're doing now. So what you do now is exactly how it will be forever. So just keep that in mind, because the last thing you want to do is have this clicked off, do a pose, go to the next key, do another pose, go back to your previous key, and the pose is gone. If you want to keep your work, make sure this is on. The only time you should have this off is if you want to move an animation permanently to one position or another. Now this here is a transform tool. I use this tool for everything. So you can reposition, scale, skew, and everything else that it says down there. So I usually have this clicked on the whole time. This here is the inverse kinematics. We'll talk about this later on when we get into rigging, but I rarely touch this button at all. This here is the onion skin. I'll show you real quick what it looks like. So here is frame 1, and on frame 2, if I had this squiggly line, I can turn on my onion skin and it'll ghost out what I had before, and you can decide how the threshold of your onion skin by moving these brackets on the timeline up here. I rarely use that either, but most people like it. So that does it for the tool set bar. The next thing we're going to look at is the timeline. Now the timeline, like I said, I have this playback option turned on because I want to talk about a few things here. Up here is the play button. Here is the render button. So this spits out a quick render of your movie in full res. However, you might as well just export your movie, because I find unless you're previewing just little segments, it takes just as long as for you to export an actual movie. This is the loop button, so it basically plays back on a loop if you have this pressed down. When you import audio, and I'll show you how to do that in another session, the audio will not play unless you have this clicked on. You can have this to toggle your audio, to scrub your audio, so you can basically listen as you go. So as you can see, this basically scrubs along the timeline up here. You can also punch in the number you want to be at here. This is your start, basically where you want the animation to play and where you want the animation to stop playing. And you can change those numbers as you go. And same for the frame rate, frames per second here. So we talked a bit about the camera already. We've been using it quite exclusively. You can turn on the camera view. The camera view gives you various options here. Most of which you'll use is just this field chart, if you ever use it at all. The other thing I like to use is flattening your work. Now, you can draw on the drawing. It'll keep the same settings up here. You can draw in your drawing window or your camera window at any point. So there's my line art, this is my color art. If I go into my drawing, that's my color art and my line art. So you can basically draw in both views. Here is the light table. You can set the onion skin thresholds. These are just to lock the layers that you're currently working on. These here are guides to show controls, and we'll get more into that later on, to hide controls and show controls. These here you can add. There's so many variations of onion skin that you can test out, but try experimenting with these. These are just flipping horizontal, flipping vertical, your drawings. Okay, so under the drawing, the same thing. Let me see what else. The library. Alright, so when you're drawing something in your library here, your library basically exists to complement what you have for your drawing. So if I drew a circle here, it's going to show up as instance drawing 4, instance 4, in my library. We'll talk more about instances and symbols later on, but what you need to know is that every time you draw something on your drawing symbol, it'll create a new drawing substitution, which I call an instance. And you can see that in your library. You can also save whole characters and reuses in your library. Now, the way to do that is you have to create a library. So all you do is you open up your library. I'm just going to set it up on my desktop here. And I'll set it to my Windows UI folder here. And you just right click, right to modify, and you can save stuff into your library. Now how that works is if you go to your drawing symbol here, you can copy this, go down here, you have to click right to modify, and you're just going to paste your symbol. This is a symbol, and I'll name this squiggle. When you create, when you copy and paste anything into your library, it creates its own separate project folder, and that appears as a TPL. And that allows you to drag and drop into any stage, and it'll duplicate that for you. So now we have 2 of these squiggle symbols because I just dragged it into this node view. Now the node view is the biggest thing here. Now we'll dive more into node view later on, but I want to explain a few things. Like in the other video, as a default, you're going to get a write module, which will allow you to dictate where your files get exported. So in this case, it's going to be exported in a folder called frames. As a default, it's going to also spit out some TGA stuff, drawing instances. You can set the resolution here. And on the right here is the display module. If I disconnect this, you won't see anything here because the display module, as you can see up here, will show whatever is connected to it. So if you connect everything to the display module, you'll be able to see that. You can also rename the display module and have multiple display modules. So this I will rename to squiggle, close, and you'll see up here it says squiggle. So if I disconnected my composite to the squiggle, you won't see it anymore. But I can connect it and you'll see it again. Now if I connect basically anything to a different composite, you'll see whatever's connected to that composite. We'll talk more about that later on. So what we have here in this node view is a network. In this network you'll see everything currently on our main top view, as it's called. And everything that we have, usually in a production, you would see connected to a composite, then connected to a write module and a display module. In this case, we only have one drawing. Usually you would get a folder called character and a folder called backgrounds, and those would be connected to your composite. The difference between a drawing, a peg, and a composite, and a symbol we'll cover in a next video. What you need to understand about the node view is it coincides with what you see on your timeline. So if I was to create a new drawing, Control R, and call this box. And I'm just going to close this. And if I connected the box, and let me just draw a box so we have a visual, and we'll fill it. We'll fill it rainbow color. Okay, so now I have a box. Oops, I have a box and I have a drawing. As you can see on my timeline, the drawing is on top of the box. So you see the red line, red squiggle is on top of the box. But if I reposition this box and place it to the left of my drawing, you'll see that now the box is on top of the drawing. And on my timeline, you'll also see that the box is on top of the drawing. So this is what we talk about when we talk about hierarchies. The higher an object is on the timeline, the higher above it is, or to the left it is on the composite. So if I was to move this up now, you'll see that the connection has changed and now the drawing is on top. Okay, so that's how that works. Usually the connections just move, not so much these little boxes in the node view. So that's the hierarchy. Now here's a big tip for you guys using smaller screens or just single screens. There's this box called parameters. Now these parameters basically show the instance number that is being represented in your library. So scene number 5, it's showing number 5. And the box is showing drawing number 1, drawing number 1. Now I find this completely a waste of space, so in order to get rid of it, just simply press this button here and that'll toggle it out. So now you have more real estate for your timeline. There are several other options you can do. You can do selection mode. You can tag your layers as well. We'll get into those things later on. You can also show additional features. You don't really need to show anything here. More or less, when you're animating, you try to keep this exposing as much of the timeline as possible and less of the actual links and parameters buttons here. So just unclick those. Alright, so I believe that covers everything here. Above here, you'll see that there's all these here are coordinates. I can just right click and I'll hide the coordinates. So the coordinates basically show you where the drawing is positioned. So if I move this drawing is now positioned there, 6 east and 4 north. If I move it down, it'll be 11 south. So it shows you the position of it. And this is Z depth. We'll get more into that later on. It's a nice feature that Harmony has. So, and this here is just scale. If I scaled that up unproportionally, it'll give you the scale. 1 being 100%. And then you can also rotate it. When you rotate it, it's going to give you, actually you can't rotate it without showing it here without a peg, but we'll get into more of that later on. I'm just gonna hide the coordinates. And here is basically where we attribute peg anchor points, which we'll get into later on as well. So we're just going to ignore this panel as well. This is our display, as we discussed. These are our deformers, deformer options, which we can also ignore for now. So deformation. And over here, this is undo. You can even get rid of that. That's just your tools. Oh, wait, nope, sorry, we need our tools. This is, I don't know what this is. But, okay, we'll just leave that. So these are just your basic open file, save as. Now, one of the things, one last thing before we end this video, there's a huge difference between save as, and save as a new version. When you save as a new version, you can basically put volume 2 or version 2. Now, when you do that, it's going to create a new X stage. It's still going to use all the same elements from your libraries. So when you save this, you have the option of opening up an older version. Now, this is great. This is a great way to back up your work if you're doing small changes. Once you do a big change, however, I would highly recommend you save as. When you save as, I'm just going to save it. I'll save it in here as Windows user interface version 02. Okay. So when you save as, you're essentially creating 2 project folders. So here's version 2 Windows UI. The reason why you want to do this sometimes is because you don't want to confuse the libraries. Because if you decide that you're going to use if you decide that you're going to save a project and your box is, let's say, red, in version 1, and then you go to version 2 and you make the box and it's green. If you go back to version 1, it's still going to be green, only because it's referencing the same environment and properties and elements inside the project. So if you're going to make a big change, like this, a color change, then you want to go File, Save As. That's very important. And save is basically overriding what you previously saved. So those are the three different things to keep in mind. So that's basically it for the user interface part 2, where we're talking about Windows. Now, I know this is a long video, but please refer back to this particular video if you get lost, because there's a huge immersive environment in Harmony, and the last thing we want everybody to feel is overwhelmed. So just go back to this video and have a look at all the things that you actually need to look at, and ignore everything else. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Bye.